Hello, everyone, and welcome to the special event where we're going to talk about the history of English teaching. Now, I'm teaching English, and I know that many of you are as well. And I think it's going to be quite interesting to ask the question, where did this all begin and why? And hopefully draw some interesting lessons that we can apply to today on sort of forecasting and foreseeing new business or teaching opportunities. And so without any further ado, let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. This is, yeah, here we go. All right. So the history of English teaching. Now, I should probably start out by telling you that I am a history professor. That's my first calling as a teacher, is history. So English, obviously I communicate in English, so I'm using it a lot. But teaching history is what we say in English, that's my day job. And so the other stuff is mainly for fun. But if you notice here, what's interesting, this is an old photo of, early English classes. You can see the four very distinguished ladies on the left, and you can tell they're distinguished by the hat or caps they're wearing. These aren't just normal ladies. These are going to be from the upper class, the aristocracy, this sort of it's actually Milwaukee, so you don't have aristocracy, but you will have upper class. And you might be wondering, why do you need to learn English in the United States? And if you weren't wondering that, I'm going to tell you, you should be wondering that. So I just realized I will pin myself here. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. All right, there we go. So what's interesting is that, as we all know, we might have an answer here. Hello. As we all know, that the U.S. is a nation of immigrants, and it wasn't uncommon to come here without any knowledge of English. I'll give you some examples later. And so one of the first things you have to do in order to acculturate yourself, that sort of, become part of the culture, mainstream culture and society, is of course speak the language. Now, I can speak with authority on this because I lived through it. Now, not me personally, but my family, my mother's side is Italian, and they emigrated. My grandfather was born in Italy, and like many Italians, came to the United States for economic reasons. They wanted a better life for themselves and their families, and thousands and millions of people came in this wave. This date of 1900 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, is not an accident. From the 1890s to the early 1920s, this was the greatest wave period of immigration in the history of the U.S. And up until the 1920s, you could just show up, get on a boat, go to Ellis Island in New York, register, put your name down, sign a document, and you're welcome. You're a U.S. citizen. Now, that began to change after the war, World War I, and you then there were these quotas started to be implemented. Honestly, they started with Asians first. There was a bit of a racial policy that actually predated 1900, we say Sinoan, or sort of Chinese or Asian, they were the first that was sort of capped. Later it became, now we associate with sort of South America, Latin America, where we have limits on the number of people that can enter. But the point is, people were coming, and these people look like the European, but they didn't know English very well. And of course, you can see at the bottom, all the teachers were concerned, all lessons must be paid in advance. In advance means before you take the lesson. All right, so we'll get started here. I find it interesting that there are 2 teachers in the room and 4 students. Do you notice the photo there? 2 teachers and 4 students. Now, if you notice here on the left, what language is this? Do you see that? I'll tell you, it's French. And we're going to get to French a little bit later. So remember that little tablet or that poster there in French, because we're going to talk about why that's there. All right. Now, at any point, if you'd like to ask a question, if you want to just raise your hand, there's on your Zoom screen, there is something where emotions, you can raise your hand, look at how to do it. If you don't know how to do it, you can just ask. Let's get directly to the answer of the topic. Why did English teaching proliferate? Proliferate is a fancy word for expand or grow. Why did English teaching as a foreign language proliferate or grow? Two main reasons: politics and holidays. Politics, the British Empire expanded, and then holidays, people went on holiday. And you know, if you're traveling, if your country is known for going to a certain place, I'll give you an example. Russians love to go to Egypt, or sorry, Russian-speaking people, a lot of them go to Egypt. And so it's not uncommon for Egyptians doing business or in the service industries like hotels, they'll learn Russian so they can accommodate visitors from that country or those countries. Many, of course, many countries speak Russian. So it's really interesting that, so what is happening back then with the British Empire is no different than what's happening today. You want to entice means bring, entice people to visit your country, and you can do that better if you speak their language. And that was the case with the British. The British Empire grew, which made them the wealthiest. And when you have money, sometimes, as we know with the Industrial Revolution, you have time. And this is the first period in history where we have very wealthy people outside of the monarch, the sort of the political figures. So you can actually now have time and money. You build business. Obviously, there was this travel before the Industrial Revolution in Britain. We called it landed aristocracy. So you were rich in two ways in Britain. You owned a lot of land that you rented out, which of course gave you a lot of free time. That was landed aristocracy, from land, and they were obviously in the House of Lords, so part of Parliament. And then later in the 19th century, during the Industrial Revolution, people started to own their own businesses, and that's the second way. People grew wealthy, and that gave them time to travel, and that gave rise to the need of teaching English. So one little background here. Elite education. Elite means the aristocracy, the upper class, the wealthy, lots of synonyms. Before English, it was French. Before you were forced to learn English with people like Professor Corton, you were forced to learn French by Madame, Mademoiselle, Monsieur, mainly men, so Monsieur, and you were learning French. And that's what the upper class learned. You knew you were upper class, or you knew you weren't. You could sort of divide it if people could speak French. So if you look at the period of Peter the Great, and interesting in sort of Eastern Europe, in Poland, Russia, and these areas of the Baltics, you understood your place in society by your ability to speak French. Quite interesting. It was also the diplomatic language of the world. Or I say of the Western world. Obviously, Asia is a slightly different situation. So I'm giving you one example here. This is from the archives in Russia. I've spent a lot of time in archives all over Europe, from Italy to Russia to England and Poland. This one happens to come from Russia, where I did a lot of time in archives because I'm currently writing a book. And if you notice here, this is from the foreign minister. His name was Nesselrode. It's not important, but the foreign minister of the Russian Empire to the envoy here. You can see Monsieur l'Envoyé is the envoy or ambassador in Warsaw. And they didn't speak Polish. They didn't speak Russian. They spoke French. That's how they communicated. So all the diplomatic language was French. And so you had to learn French. Then Britain started to become important because of their expansion of the empire and business. So the rise of English as a language and as a profession, a teaching profession, coincides, that means overlaps in time with the expansion of the British Empire. Now, at any point you have a question, you can pause it. I'll stop sharing it halfway through, and we can talk for a minute. So, to give you an idea of how vast or how quickly the British Empire expanded, I want to show you maps. This is the British Empire in 1815. I'm going to make myself a little bit smaller so you can see. There's India. India was known as the gem. It was they called it the British rye. Rye is like heaven. It was because it literally made Britain the most money with the spice trade. America was second, but they of course leave with a revolution. Canada holds on for a bit longer. So we have 1815. Remember that map. Here is 55 years later. Look at how it fills in. Britain has a vast holding. Obviously, the United States is no longer there, but that's a historical thing. So, but you can see all of the different areas. This small little continent, there's Britain right there. The British Isles is what they're called. That's Britain, and that's all the land they control. It's pretty remarkable, actually. And you can see the countries that this represents today. Obviously, parts of the United States. As I said, the wealthiest parts were the United States, the Caribbean, and India. Australia, of course, will become a country, but it wasn't a place where they were getting wealthy from. It was going to be here. And then, unfortunately, with the slave trade on the Gold Coast, it was actually initiated right here. You would have this trade, and that's where the slave trade took place. Lots of wealth derived from the very unfortunate, very, unacceptable slave trade that took place that actually would bring them to Havana, Cuba. Very few of them went to the US, they went to Cuba, and then from Cuba, they sort of spread out to South and North America. All right, so Britain has now a presence all over the world, and guess what?
Inclusive in Uruguay. Inclusive in Uruguay.
I'm sorry?
Inclusive Uruguay. Yes,
now,
we were British. We were British in 1806 and 1807. We experienced the British invasions, and they did a lot of stuff here.
So in 1 year, only one year.
In 2 years, they founded the train net. The trains net we have nowadays is British, the newspapers, and a lot of things. But at that point, 200 years ago, Portugal and Spain were fighting for our country, which is Uruguay nowadays. All of three, the British Empire and Portugal and Spain, they came out to come to us. It comes to be out a solution, and the solution were granted our independence.
And when was Uruguay granted independence?
In 1825.
1825, okay.
But it was thanks to Lord Ponsonby. Lord Ponsonby was a British guy, an English businessman. And
Very
the power they have here. And also having the Falklands.
Yeah, the Falklands is an interesting story as well. Yeah. That's interesting about Uruguay, and thank you for sharing. I like that. The British, by 1806, though, it was mainly the British versus the French, which is quite interesting linguistically as well, because it was France, the French language, which will slowly take second place or be overcome by the English. And the reason that takes place is because it first took place on the battlefield. The victor calls the shots or determines the language. And that's what happened. We don't have time to do it, but if you would look at Canada and India, that's where the French and the British were really these were key battlefields. And it's no accident that Montreal and Quebec, which are two of the largest cities in Canada, are both French speaking, because the French founded them and then later the British took over, but they didn't lose their language. And today Canada is a bilingual country. You might not know that, but all of the messages in the governments are French and English, although the closer you get to Montreal and Quebec, you have both languages, and it's really interesting. You have to know French if you want to serve in serious posts in government, which is quite interesting. In India is the same case, actually, but less prominent French. But here's what I want to say, and it sort of dovetails. Dovetail means coincides or sort of merges with what Patricia was saying. They did a lot for infrastructure. Infrastructure means buildings, roads, schools, railways, network. She said network of railways, etc. And that is the main point I want to show here, is that wherever the British went, they built schools. That was one of the things. They've left a legacy of education, because of course, they had Oxford and Cambridge, old institutions, so they were very early on in developing, the newest, latest forms of education. And so they understood the importance of it, and they established some of the best schools that still remain. This is in India here. This is the University of Bombay. They built part of University of Bombay in the 1850s. And so what they did is they introduced these schools. Now, these schools were not for everyone. They were for the elite. We don't have universal education in these colonized countries. You're educating the elite to then go ahead and co-opt. Co-opt means partner with, co-opt with the British Empire to help run it. So they had Indian nobility and British nobility, sort of mutually, well, it's a bit more complicated than that, but mutually sort of running the empire. So Indians speak English today because they were colonized, and their best schools were English-speaking schools. You can see here. Now, there's a bit of a paradox. A paradox means like a contradiction, because while the British were sort of forerunners, ahead of their time, like leading the way in education, finding good teachers was difficult. Now, if you own a language school or a regular school, you understand this. Finding good teachers is difficult. It was really difficult back then for several reasons. You're basically offering a teacher to travel halfway across the world, which is different than today. Once you go to India, unless you're very wealthy, you'll never come back. So it's a one-way ticket. So first of all, it's a huge commitment. Secondly, it's very low pay. I know what you're thinking, Professor, nothing's changed. But in some ways, it's right. Teachers have historically not been paid well, but when this profession begins, when they're trying to find teachers in the British Empire to people, to run the schools, it was a problem. Acute, I use the word acute shortage. Acute means very serious shortage of teachers. Why would I move halfway across the world where I don't know anyone, and it's a very dangerous trip over. You can't discount the danger on the boat. Many people were dying. Percentages of people wouldn't make it. Scurvy was the biggest thing here. So it's a very dangerous trip, also to the United States, very dangerous. Later, it gets better in the 19th century, but you're asking a lot, and then you're not going to pay much. So it's not very appealing. Now, that's the first part of the answer. The question was, what we're asking, how did the English language teaching profession grow? It grew with the expansion of the British Empire, who then built schools. The second way it grew was with British tourists going to Italy. And so we're going to talk about that. The key idea, as people began to travel more, travel for pleasure. This is a really new thing. Sort of begins in the 17th century, develops a little bit more in the 18th. By the 19th century, there are a lot of people with money who can afford to travel, and they love Italy. The Brits love Italy most of all. And so that's their final, I'll show you a map, that's their final destination. So when you're traveling to a country, suddenly for the first time, you have a sort of a clash not only of cultures, but of languages. How are you going to communicate? Well, some of them could communicate in French, but they didn't, no British knew Italian, and no Italians knew English. So what's going to happen? And I will, before we get to that question, well, I'll tell you, they learned English. That was the answer. But Brits did like to learn a smattering. A smattering is very little, a smattering of Italian. Characteristics of a holiday traveler in the period we're talking about, 17th century to 19th century. They went to France first, then to Germany, but ultimately they wanted to go to Italy. And who went? Young men, early 20s, right after high school. And they would go with probably a tutor, maybe a guardian of some sort. And this was considered educational. It was an educational holiday. And the British, the Americans don't have this, but the British have a tradition called the gap year. And for those of you who have been to Britain or know that, you know, studied British culture, a gap year is very popular still today. So a lot of the people I met in Oxford and Cambridge, they had taken a gap year. After high school, take 1 year out to travel. That's a direct practice of this grand tour that we talked about right here. Oh, I don't have it down here. It's called the Grand Tour of Europe. That's exactly the same tradition carried on. Now they travel all over the world. They might go and do, you know, volunteer work in Africa or teach English in Asia just to have an experience before then they start their university. It's the same thing here. These holidays lasted a year. So these were very serious. You had to have money to take these holidays. So what were they doing? They were looking at art, architecture, sculptures. This is what they were, and Italy was the center. Obviously, France was also well developed, but Italy was the focal point, and they would go and they would study and learn about art and architecture. And that's how that's how the elite refined themselves and became, you know, more educated. Now, here's the itinerary. An itinerary is a plan of where you're going to be on what day. That's called an itinerary. And we often associate itineraries with travel. So if we're planning a trip, I could say, what's the itinerary? And you would say the first 3 days in Paris, 1 day in Luzon, 2 days in Venice, 1 day in Florence. That's an itinerary. So where did they go? These are the main places they went. They also went to other places, Zurich. They went to Germany. There were places in Germany. But I want to focus on Italy because that's where the Brits stayed. And this is important to remember. Brits loved Italy so much, and a lot of people love Italy, by the way, not just the Brits. They would live there part of the year or just move there and retire. So you had very wealthy British people, communities in the center of Florence who'd been there for years. And so if you look and you do reading and diaries of the 19th century, you have what we know as enclaves. Enclaves are small groups of people who would live right in the center because they had the money, remember, so they had the best places. And of course, the locals loved to rent it out because you could triple the price. And for the Brits, it was still reasonable. So they made a lot of money on the tourists. So they were very, very welcoming of foreigners. So Brits have a very long-standing relationship with Italy, and they would stay. I will tell you, the most popular place was Florence. Rome was probably the second most popular. There were also Brits in Venice, but they would also, if you see on the right, they would visit Pisa with the Leaning Tower. Padua has one of the oldest, I think it's the oldest law faculty, but it's a very, very respected university. Bologna is Italy's oldest university town. And then from there, they would rest in Rome. Rome was often the final place because that's where the church, the Catholic Church was. And of course, the Catholic Church was, in addition to being a religion, was the largest benefactor or patron of the arts. They commissioned everything you see in Rome. If you've been to Rome, you'll know. We'll show, I'm not going to show many pictures, unfortunately, but they had lots of things there. So when you're staying there for a long time, suddenly someone's got to change the language. You can't speak English and they speak Italian because it's not going to work. So the Italians started to learn English. And that's where English teaching in America, I'm sorry, in Europe, it was in Paris, it was a bit in Germany, but it was mainly in Italy. And so English teachers started to go to Italy. Now, who were some of the most famous of these these wealthy young people traveling? There were three writers, some of the three most prominent romantic writers of the era. I'm talking now of the early 19th century. The early 19th century means 1810s, 20s, and 30s. Lord Byron had a great, I mean, his life was really interesting. Short, compact, and interesting. He moves to, I think he goes to Venice, he rents a palace, because that's what they could do. When you're elite or aristocracy, you could just rent a whole villa. And that's what he did. Here's this young man, very handsome, very intelligent, renting a villa in the center of Venice. I mean, it's just, you know, it's quite a life. And he fell in love with the landlord's wife. And for those of you who know Lord Byron's story, this is really quite salacious reading, very interesting. And then he gets this spirit of the day. The Greeks want independence in the early 1820s, and he's, you know, I don't know, Europe went crazy over this. And so people like Lord Byron went to Greece to fight on behalf of Greece against the Ottoman Empire. And he dies there in the war. That's not so important for us, but the point is he stayed in Italy along with Shelley and Keats. These are three of the four great romantic poets in England. And all three of them find their way to Italy. Keats, I think, stays in Rome. Shelley is in Rome for a bit. You can see their house. I will make my photos smaller so you can see the plaque. I think Shelley dies in Naples, but I will make it even smaller. So let me just disappear for a second. You can see, if you know Rome at all, this is near the Spanish Stairs, right next to the Spanish Stairs. This is the place to be. It's also the most expensive area to rent in. Here is that house right here. It's now a museum, but that's where they stayed, right in the center, because that's where the Brits could afford it. And so the Italians are very happy to rent their houses out and make a very good income. And so today, if you go to the center here at the Spanish Steps, you'll see the Keats Shelley house, where they resided for a period of time. All right. Before I now I'm going to start talking about English teaching. I'm going to now start very centrally about English teaching. Do you have any questions before sort of at the halfway point? I don't want to take longer than an hour. Are there any questions? Yasmin, you're muted.
I'm sorry. I'm wondering about why did they choose to speak, choose to learn English, not Italian?
Okay, so I mean, if you're the power, so they had the money, and so it's. Yeah, I mean, if I'm paying a lot of money to rent your house, I mean, it's sort of your obligation to serve me. So there's that imbalance of power. And so anywhere the British occupied, or even as tourists, you feel, now I'll be honest, we're going to talk about this, the British also felt compelled to learn Italian, but out of the love of the language, really. A little bit of utility, like practical day-to-day things, but mainly from this sort of romantic image of, oh, it'd be so great to speak Italian, because it sounds so beautiful. It's so melodious when you speak it. But it wasn't primarily for utility. The onus is O-N-U-S. The onus or burden or responsibility was on the host country, because they needed the money. So it was in their best interest to learn English. And as you know, and from here we develop a reputation, because everywhere the Brits went, everyone was sort of obsequious. This is a very big word. Obsequious means flattering, because they knew Brits were wealthy. So when you have this sort of relationship, you don't have to learn the language. And so now today, the reputation among Americans and British they're terrible at learning languages. because we've had 2 centuries of being lazy because we didn't have to learn it. People learned our language because we were the ones with the money. Now that's of course changing today. Today it's very interesting, but that was some of the dynamics. Good question. I hope I answered it. Yes.
I would like to share with you that in Uruguay, the education was French. Now it's changing, but the whole history of our country, which is only 200 years, is French. Yes.
Yes.
And it used to
You know
be
what's
everything
interesting?
in French.
Yeah, well, what's interesting, even the French colonial countries, I can instance Algeria, I can instance Tunisia, they have slowly adopted English as the primary language, even though they have rested under French empire, French control for many years. Donatella has a question. Yeah.
I was taught in French. Yes.
Okay. Yes.
At school, yes, it was obliged. I was obliged.
Obligatory, yes.
Yes, it was obligatory French, but not nowadays. It changed.
Yes.
It's English now for.
Donatella.
Okay, mine wasn't exactly a question. I was wondering why, with such an old history, we are not among the best at speaking English in Europe. I mean, Swedish, German speak better English than ours.
Yeah, Donatella, we're going to talk about this, unfortunately, purtroppo. We're going to talk about the Italians and their inability. Now, Donatella is the exception, but the really difficult, Italians have a great difficulty in speaking English. I mean, I'm speaking generally, not specifically. And we'll talk about that a little bit actually, we're going to turn to it right now. And so this is a very appropriate segue. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. And we're going to move right to, let me go ahead and move this. Excuse me, I'll pin myself here again. Okay, so we're going to move now. So a few aspects. Now we're getting into the English teachers. This is the micro history that's really, for me, lovely. Micro history is these small little vignettes. Vignettes is a French word, which means stories. These anecdotes, these stories, which I think enliven the history. They make it real. And you think, oh my gosh, that's not too different from what I experience today. And so when you have that connection with history, it becomes alive. You think, okay, I can get this. I understand this. So I think just speaking as a teacher now, a history professor, one of the things that's interesting and challenging is to find these stories that relate with today so that 2 things happen. People become more interested and they remember it. So we're going to start with Charles O'Connor. Charles O'Connor was a student in Rome. Now, Rome was the first place where you truly had an international student body, where people from all over Europe and even beyond Europe, in other parts of the world, would come to study. They were studying to be priests, so they were part of the church, but they wanted to learn from the center where the Pope is. And so it was prestigious, very, important, popular. If you studied in Rome, you were really important in the church. You could go home and say, well, I was in Rome, I met the Pope. So there was a lot of prestige, but it also took money. So there was an element early on when you look at the criteria for enrollment, everyone was noble. Now, that changed a bit later. If the bishop liked you, he would sponsor you. But in general, that was this. Now, there's another characteristic about early English teachers. They were Irish, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. But Charles O'Connor is interesting, comes from a great family, a really long tradition. O'Connor is quintessentially Irish. But O'Connor, his father was very famous, knew James Boswell, Samuel Johnson, considered by Boswell the greatest thinker of the day, which is something because Boswell was considered the greatest English thinker of the day. So that his son came to Rome to study, did 3 years, graduated from the Irish College. I've written a book on the Irish College and in the history of Rome. And then the rector, the head of the college, who's Italian, asked him to teach English to his nephew. because he saw a business opportunity here. The rector was quite greedy. He wanted more money. So he said, all right, teach English. And this is where this is where the story gets really interesting. So now here is O'Connor's feelings as an English teacher. Now, if any of you have taught English, tell me if this relates. Now, this is, of course, the worst scenario, but for the last 2 years, he was compelled. Compelled means forced to. You had to spend his afternoons assisting teaching the college rector's nephew in English, and here's the kicker, for free. Here's what he said. It left him, quote unquote, this is his words now, tormented and embarrassed for losing time. So that is how he felt this way. He was getting taken advantage of because he had free rent. He could stay in Rome as long as he taught English. If he stopped teaching, the rector could get him kicked out of the country. Yeah, that's right. He would have to leave. So he was really in a difficult situation. Now, listen to his understanding of the student. Now, it gets back to Donatella's point about the Italians being a little bit, it's just difficult sometimes for some Italians to learn English. Here's what Charles said, but these are in letters. This is what he wrote back home. He's an idiot. Now, he's talking about the nephew, the Italian boy. He's an idiot who's unable to apprehend English. I had to examine and correct his translations 1,000 times. And here he says again, as God is my witness in helping him and making him competent, knowing English, correcting him, I was nearly dying from boredom. I'm bored. This is terrible. And I swear that I would not do it again, even for a lot of money. The hassle which I suffered for this dunce. Dunce is an old-fashioned word for a stupid person, not very intelligent. Dunce of a nephew who has no thought of paying me. That's compensating, paying me, and with an irreparable waste of the best time of my life. So if it's irreparable, it means you can never repay it. You can't get those years back. They're lost forever. No money can buy back that time in the early 20s, which, you know, was considered some of your best years because you're now fully an adult and that's when you can sort of do things. He wanted to enslave me another year. So for some of you who don't like teaching, don't feel bad. Charles O'Connor felt he compared it to slavery, which was very well alive and well still in some parts of the world at that time. Now, Donatella mentioned, why are Italians so difficult? It's difficult. Italians have been historically poor in English, and I don't have an answer for that because what's ironic, and Donatella knows this, they are brilliant, some of the best scholars in the world in Latin and Greek. But of course, these are dead languages. You just have to study them. You don't have to speak them. But Italians are some of the best classical linguists, is what we call them, classical linguists. But they have struggled with English historically, and it didn't start now. It started from the very inception. Inception means beginning. Mario Torlonia, which if you live in Rome, you've probably heard this name. This is the first big banking family in Rome. And in fact, on the right is their villa, which is now a museum. I mean, they owned a lot of Rome, but they were very, very wealthy. And they often did partnerships with the Rothschilds banking. We've heard of Rothschilds, perhaps, the large Jewish banking concern, which is headquartered in London. Anyway, so they had enough money to send Mario to London, full immersion in English. Came back, forgot everything. Just couldn't. So we have here, could only muster. Muster means produce a few lines, just forgot all of his English. And so that is quite an interesting story. Educating the elite. So here we have the aristocracy. So we have here, she had an exquisite means very prestigious, very special education with a professor, not only in English, but also German and French. So if you were really aristocratic, you learned English, but you still learned French in the 19th century. It was still a point of social status. German was actually quite extra and not so common. Now, I'm going to move a little bit quickly over this. Travelers started to learn Italian. So we have Yasmin asked, why didn't the British learn Italian? Well, some of them who decided to stay in Florence, as we all know, if you go to a different country, I'm in Poland, you have to speak the language or you're going to struggle at some point. And so some people never did. A lot of Brits stayed and didn't know any Italian. But people like Lucy understood that her family's holiday in Italy was to be successful. It was incumbent, meaning it was in her best interest if she learned to learn Italian, which she did diligently 2 hours a day. So she did it for holiday English, you know, holiday Italian, just like some of us learn English or whatever language for our holiday. So there's some of the reasons have never changed. I will finish this and then you guys we can have a discussion. Now, what is an attribute or aspect or characteristic of English teachers at the time? I've already alluded to it. They were poor and often Irish. And so people taught English in desperation. Not all of them, obviously not all of them. You know, if you were a tutor for a king's children or, you know, nobility, you could do well. And these were very prestigious positions. But I'm talking now about schools. And as we start to sort of populate the schools, it wasn't the best position to have. So the young Irishman, Edward MacDonald, he's just a representative of a large group of English teachers, hoped teaching English would change his financial situation. He says in a letter, owing to my poverty and for my purpose of occupying my time in some useful way. In other words, because I'm poor and I want to do something with my time, I don't want to just sit around. I would like to teach English. This is what he's saying here, as the English language is much studied now in Florence. Now, he's speaking in the middle of the 19th century. Now, a lot of people are learning English. I would undertake to give private lessons in English to the children of the upper class, the nobility and the gentry. So it was a way to earn extra money, just as it is today. So in many ways, it never changed. Now, the most famous of these Irish was James Joyce. James Joyce is known for Ulysses, the Dubliner, the Exile. One of Ireland's greatest, and one of the greatest writers in the English language. He was an English teacher, and he had to survive teaching English, whether he liked it or not. He left Ireland in debt. He was promised, and this is before, obviously, this is before the internet. Obviously. And so it was the time when you had newspapers and they would put in advertisements and things, but he heard there was a teaching position open in Zurich. I think it was Zurich in Switzerland. He gets to Zurich. I mean, this is a long travel, expensive travel to Switzerland. He gets to the school, knocks on the door, and they say, we don't know what you're talking about. There's no opening here. So he's now married, young, poor, with a child. No, they don't have his first child. They go to Trieste because they say, go to Trieste. Now, they went to the Berlitz school. Berlitz is one of the oldest English schools. Here's the track. So he goes from Zurich, which is here, to, you can see here, Trieste. It's in the red here, the red pin. And the Berlitz school says as well, sorry, we don't have any openings. I don't know who you heard that from, but we're full. Thank you. So he has to go to this really small town and teach English for 1 year. Then he goes back to Trieste and is a teacher there for a while. He's in Trieste on and off, meaning there and sometimes not, on and off for about 15 years. And he has a child there and then another child. And he's financially has a very difficult time and has to survive for much of his life, not most of his life, but for some of his time teaching English. I don't know, what an experience it would have been to say that James Joyce taught me English. James Joyce, as I mentioned, is one of the greatest writers of the English language. Here he is in here. And he also did some lecturing at Padua, but not much. Here's Joyce. Another thing about these expats, when you're going away, oftentimes you ran away from problems, or you had problems, or you're a little bit maladjusted. There's something wrong with you a little bit. Joyce was like that. He loved to drink. He drank too much. This caused problems in many different areas of his life, including financially. So yeah, there were always these little issues, and going to another country was sort of a way to hide that from back home, but it didn't make your life any easier. I'm going to just, I'll speak for about 5 more minutes and then we'll stop. Here's another anecdote. I'm actually in the book I'm writing, and I'm on this chapter. I'm writing chapter 21 of my book at the moment. It's on cholera, the epidemic that hit Rome in the summer of 1837. And there's one story in here I added to our discussion. On the evening of the 14th of August, a Prussian named Kanzel, a teacher of the English language, on the eastern slopes of the Capitoline Hill, which is near, it's the center, it's near the Colosseum, actually, if you've been to Rome, was beaten by a mob, by a group of people who believed he had poisoned a young Roman boy. Now, here's what happened. This is really interesting and very tragic. He was walking by, I don't know, somebody saw him touch or hug a boy. Now, during cholera, people were paranoid about touching anybody. And so they kept distance because they felt that's the way you transmit means give off, and that's how you die. People were dying. So this is a life or death matter. Don't touch me. It's a little bit like in COVID. At the beginning of COVID, when you saw someone in public sneezing without covering their mouth, you know, that's a death sentence for an older person, possibly. And that's what they thought here. They attacked him. They went crazy and they killed him. They beat him. They threw him in the river, and he died a few days later, if I'm not mistaken. But he didn't make it. Now, that's not the most important aspect of the story, although it is very interesting. What's most interesting is that this English teacher is Prussian, not English. We now have, by the 1830s, and even earlier in Italy, we have foreigners teaching English, not native speakers. So we have foreigners here. This one's German. But we have foreigners teaching English, which of course a lot of you are teaching English as a foreigner. So you're a non-English native. I think that's quite interesting, and it sort of segues into this. I found in my research on a previous book that at least I found 4 men in Italy, in Rome, teaching English, Italians teaching English in the 1790s, which I think should be very heartening for Donatella to know that there are some Italians who are very, very good. Obviously, there are many Italians who are great in English. But in the 1790s, when very few foreigners knew English, there were 4 Italian teachers teaching English, which I think is quite interesting. The final area, I'm going to go through this very quickly, and I'll probably just talk over my slides. Then I want to have a discussion, or you can ask questions or make comments. English and religion. English grows in importance, and religion plays an interesting symbiotic role. Symbiotic means 2 different pieces come together to benefit the other. That's a symbiotic relationship. Now, interestingly, Paris had the most native speakers in early on. This is 1830s, 40s. And the reason Paris had the most native speakers is not because they were richer than Britain, but they were richer than all other Catholic areas of the world. France was, by comparison, the wealthiest country in the Catholic kingdom. Now, southern Germany, Tyrol where we see Munich, Bavaria, that will come up later in the century. But we have in Paris, that's where the money was actually in the 19th century for the Catholic Church. Now, Britain, keep in mind, they're not Catholic. They are Protestant. They're Anglican, actually, a form of Protestantism. So the wealthiest Catholics were French, mainly, and Germans, but French, and they had the most native speakers because they could afford to pay them. And it was close to London. Paris and London are not very far. So proximity means close, proximity, and pay. So they had, you can see here, very many, moltissimi, such teachers. The implication being that they were there to teach French missionaries. So here's what they were doing. They were teaching French missionaries to speak English because they were going into areas of the French Empire. This is the irony. I'm sorry, the British Empire. They were going into areas of the British Empire to be missionaries, to sort of talk about their religion. And they wanted to do it in English because French was becoming less and less popular and not at all spoken in the British Empire. All right. And another irony, interesting. Ironies make for interesting history. Irony means you wouldn't naturally or logically think that's the case. That's why you remember ironies a lot longer, because it surprises you. The greatest another irony is the greatest need for English teachers was in the United States. And I've sort of alluded to that in the opening slide when we saw these four ladies, distinguished ladies being taught. Most early U.S. bishops, a bishop is a high-standing member in the Catholic Church or in Christian churches in general. Most bishops were French, and they had a thick accent. Have you ever heard the French speak English? If you have, you're lucky, because they don't like to speak English, but especially if you're in France. But they have a I think they have a nice English accent, but it's very thick, meaning it's hard to understand all the words. So here's what, this is from an Irish churchman. So he's also a bishop in the Catholic Church. He says in 1834, the cities of the East, this is on the East Coast of the United States, Boston, New York. The cities of the East have had prelates, these are churchmen like bishops, whose imperfect knowledge of English of the country must make their instructions matters of ridicule rather than edification. Here's what that means. That's really big language from the 19th century. He says their English is so bad that people are probably laughing at them. No one's learning anything. They're just laughing at their bad English. And that shouldn't be. If we're teaching them religion, they can't be laughing at our accent or wondering what words we're saying, but yet it's like that. There's a very funny story I ran into doing some research about a German bishop. Now, Germans learned English very well. We talk about the Italians struggled to learn English. Germans, it was a very natural conversion, transition to English, but not for everyone. Upon the arrival of one German-speaking Jesuit, he's a member of a religious order, it occurred that he lacked the requisite means minimum level, like the minimum acceptable level, requisite level of English to hear confessions. Confessions is when someone says, oh, I've done this wrong, so I'm very sorry. He couldn't hear. So you have a confession between the priest and the person at the person going to the church. We call these a parishioner. If you go to the church, you're a parishioner. So you would go and make confession. The parishioner spoke English, didn't speak German. They were German descendants, but they didn't speak German. They forgot their German because they only speak English. They spoke English. The German didn't understand English. He would give the instructions in German. And so you have two people talking to each other who have no idea what they're talking about. And if you've ever been overseas, if you've traveled and tried to order pizza in a small Italian town, or if you've tried to order something in small towns in different countries, you've probably encountered this where they just don't understand what you're saying. This is what was happening in the church, and it was a very serious matter. One final thing before we go is that English was an opportunity, and let's end on a good note, for promotions. If you knew English, you were very important, because as the British Empire expanded, what's interesting and ironic is that the Catholic Church expanded, even though the British are not Catholic. And the reason that's so is because the British, when they expanded, brought Irish soldiers with them. And there were a lot of Irish wherever the British went. And the Irish, of course, as we know, are Catholic. And so where the Irish were, they started schools and churches. And that's where you had the expansion of the Catholic Church. So these English-speaking people suddenly become cardinals. The first cardinal of England is Nicholas White. No, sorry, he's not the first. He's the fourth or fifth. But the first Irish cardinal is Paul Cullen in 1866, because now you need an English advisor, English-speaking advisor to the Pope, because we have South America, which is all Catholic, thanks to the Spanish and the Portuguese. as Patrizia knows. So this suddenly now it's really important that we, now of course they're Spanish speaking, but the point is there are lots of other areas that are English speaking. Australia is one of them, where you just have to know English. Whereas before the 19th century, no one needed to learn English. They learned, the English who visited Rome to study were forced to learn Latin and Italian. And that was it. No one learned English until the 19th century in the Catholic Church. That's quite interesting. Because it just wasn't deemed important. Two small stories. Don't read this. I'll just tell you what's interesting and inspiring for us today. This young nurse, Sister Celestine, born in France, they started a religious order. You can see these are called nuns or sisters. They grow their community in America. She gets to the United States and says, wait a second, no one speaks French here. She studies deep, full immersion in English. After 4 years, learns that and sign language. She learns 2 languages at once. And this is interesting when you talk about, can we learn 2 languages at once? Celestine did it. She learned sign language and English at a very high level. And the point is, this French order, in a matter of 1 generation, 20 years, everyone converted to English. And that grew the community because English became the common language. And one final thing is, when you were traveling overseas, you tried to learn the local language, whether it's Sri Lanka, Burma, India, but you also always learned English and the local. Some of them were better than others. Monsignor Serretti, who's Italian, he was 50. It's hard to learn languages at 50. It's not impossible, but he didn't learn Burmese, which is where he was at, Burma, Sri Lanka today. But he did get by with English. One final thing, when you look at the history of English teaching, which is what this talk's been about, the earliest language schools you can see here, the Berlitz, the earliest, biggest language schools. Berlitz language, which began actually instructing in French and German. French first was in 1878, but quickly English became the most popular. Secondly, there are others, but the International House, very interesting, started in Spain, not in England. And then, finally, the British Council. We all know the British Council, very large organization. And here's, for further reference, British travelers. I can send you the PDF. British travelers in 18th century Italy. We've mainly talked about the 19th century, but if you want to understand some of the experiences of the 18th century, what it's like to travel at that time, there's a great article in one of the best journals, historical journals. I'm going to be quiet and listen because I've talked a lot. Do you have any questions or well, let me summarize before we leave. English teaching as a profession grew because the British Empire expanded, got wealthy, built schools everywhere they had a presence. And secondly, because the Brits, once they were wealthy, traveled, and they loved traveling to Italy. So the Italians quickly understood that they needed somehow, English needed to be learned. Thank you. Let's ask any questions or comments. The floor is open.
Oh, thank you so much, Chris. That was an amazing lesson for me. Sorry for my voice. And I want to say that it was very unexpected to get to know about French, that first you needed to learn French. Yeah. And you know what? It was interesting to get to know that in all countries, teacher was a badly paid job, yeah? So it was really interesting.
With exceptions, with the royalty.
Oh,
you're right.
I see. Because in post-Soviet countries, it's the same.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
my granny was a teacher too. She's 86, and she usually says that, you know what, my granddaughter, our job was usually badly paid, so we shouldn't expect more. So that's interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, that's right.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Anyone else want to share something, comment?
I also want to thank you for that amazing presentation and for your emotions while presenting your ideas. And I would say that internal motives to learning English is remain the same as they were centuries ago. So people want to travel and to feel confident while communicating with other people, and they want to succeed and have better opportunities in their job, and they learn English. So some things stay the same, but it was very interesting to know how it grew up.
Grew, how it grew. That's right. Thank you, Angelina. Yes. Okay. Well, if there are no more comments, I want to thank you for your undivided attention for 63 or 62 minutes. That's very impressive, especially when it's mainly one-way communication. I know it can be a bit tedious and tiring. I loved it. I've made a recording. I just want to say that at the moment, I can't upload recordings onto the platform in the speaking community. So I'm not trying to deprive people of an extra form of entertainment or education. It's just at the moment, I'm not able to do that. We'll have a workaround at some point. But thank you all for spending your evening, Sunday evening with me, and have a great week.
Yeah, thank you to you.
Thank you, Professor.